What's up guys, Tommy Bowyer here from Movie Rewind, and today I will be doing my next instalment of the history of comic book films. So without further ado, let's get into it. So in today's instalment I'm going to be talking about from 1960 to 1978 in a time which I call Comedic Experimentation. So after the turmoil in the comic book industries, there was increased censorship on comic books because do-gooders apparently said that comic books were too violent and they were causing children to be violent. So increased censorship meant that they were basically more made for children now, and this affected comic book films for the simple reason they couldn't be too violent, they couldn't be too aggressive, and they became cheesy and became, well, watchable for children. Now there are some iconic shows and films released during this period, however they're not serious, they're just flat out comedy, that's all they are. So one of the most iconic comic book films released during this time was Batman, starring Adam West. Now the Batman TV show is brilliant. I think it's a defining moment of this time in comic book films history because they were very cheesy, they were very comedic, they relied on a lot of cliches, and they weren't supposed to be taken seriously whatsoever. And that doesn't make this film bad. I actually enjoy this film because, you know, it's light-hearted, it has a lot of comedy in it, and it has a lot of stuff which the writers didn't take seriously, and audiences at the time didn't take seriously. This was made for children, and this really shows at this time comic book films were not really seen as massive blockbusters which, were seen as acceptable for all audiences. This Batman movie was a one-off. There was the TV Batman show, however this Batman movie was a one-off and it appealed to children more than it does adults. It has a cult following now. I don't know if it had a cult following at the time. However, this really does show that comic book films were not being taken seriously at this stage. They were more just seen as acceptable for children. However, while the films weren't doing too well, the animated series, they were doing a lot better. Now, while live action comic book films weren't really be taken seriously and weren't going anywhere at this stage, animated superhero series were booming at this point for the simple reason they were cheaper. They could be aired shorter times because kids' TV shows were usually shorter, and they were acceptable to the key target audience, and that was children. Children in the 60s and early 70s grew up with the likes of the 60s Spider-Man, Super Friends, and that means that they were becoming obsessed with superheroes. Now, while there weren't many superhero films released in this point, or comic book films in general at this stage, the series, the animated TV shows, would inspire a generation to be ready for more when the time came. Now there was one place in the world which was very different to all the other places at this point, and that was Japan. Now when Japan become obsessed with a certain source of media, they'll really go out of town on it. And at the time it was superheroes. Now during the late 1950s, superheroes, especially masked superheroes, were becoming more popular in Japan, and at one point even replaced giant monsters such as Godzilla as the top spot. Now, in the early 70s, they created Japanese Spider-Man. Now, while it's very, very different to any Spider-Man we know, this does show that other cultures around the world were beginning to understand the importance of superheroes and comic book films, and were beginning to create new and exciting things. Now, while this did die down in Japan after a while, it does show that in other areas of the world that weren't forced to go for the censorship which was happening with comic book films at this point, they were able to thrive in a very unique way. So in this point there was a lot of experimentation going on, there's a lot of comedy, and then you have Japan, which is just experimenting with a variety of different things because no one really knew the potential of comic book films at this point. And that's why I've called this section Comedic Experimentation, because it's a load of people trying to figure out, due to increased censorship, what comic book films could actually do. And it was a very different time. So this time during the history of comic book films was one of the most interesting as well as one of the most experimental. Due to increased censorship, they couldn't really do a lot with comic book films at this point. While there was standout moments such as the Batman movie, there weren't a lot at this time. However, comic book TV shows thrived during this period and left a generation ready and awaiting for new comic book films. And when a little movie called Star Wars was released in the 70s, and caused a massive hype and interest in fantasy again, comic book films would be at the centre stage once more. So thanks for watching, guys. I really do hope you enjoyed my latest instalment in the history of comic book films. Please remember to like, comment and subscribe in order to receive great and maybe even improved quality content in the future. And I will see you in another one. See ya!